Right, so we're starting today with the house movers section. This is hearing 16, so house movers section of the New Zealand Heavy Haulers Association. Jonathan, I can see you there. Welcome back.
I am. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah.
So you're in Wellington today, Jonathan?
I am in Wellington today, yes.
I think everyone's sticking pretty close to home from what I can see.
Yeah, you'd be exactly right. Yep.
Yes, and I understand probably from this will be the last one for a while. It will be sort of zooming into the council chambers because of just the next week or two, just while things evolve. But it's yeah. So look, we've read your evidence, Jonathan. So if you want to just, but I would like you to give us the highlights package of your main points, and then we can go to questions.
Absolutely. No, that'll be great. Thank you very much. Nothing like talking about the exciting topic of house moving at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, is there, really? So once again, thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the ability to zoom in and present to you guys in this way. I think that's it's very useful for us to be able to do so. So yeah, as you've said, we've pretty much stated our case in our written submission. But listen, I just wanted to highlight a few points. And so as you know, we're seeking consistency across many of the zones in the New Plymouth area for the unlocking of the benefits that relocated housing and buildings can bring to commercial property owners, particularly in this zone. So we do acknowledge that in the commercial and mixed zones that residential isn't generally supported. And so really the focus in this area is relocation of buildings that do have a commercial use. So as our written submission states, you'll know that the association supports the position of the planner in the Section 42A report that determines that relocators should have permitted activity status. We're pleased to see that. And it's good to see that the consistency across the zones is starting to come through. Obviously, there's some little intricacies amongst the different zones, but we're pleased to see the general picture becoming clear. However, we do disagree with the analysis in the Section 42A report that kind of looks at a worst case scenario of a building that's in a poor state being relocated into one of the commercial and mixed use zones that then seems to require that the use of a bond to motivate the upgrading of the building is a requirement. In our experience, and this is this from the submissions that we've made in many council areas around the country, the reinstatement report that identifies in advance the work that's needed to be completed is, in our view, the best way to rectify any work that is required on these buildings. On a commercial building, we think that this is likely to have limited scope. However, we do accept and perhaps promote that this is a good way to achieve the outcome of the building fitting onto the plot on which it is placed. So whilst the planner identifies that the definition of a works reinstatement report includes the timeline for completion of the works identified, we do believe that reinforcing this with a performance condition in the plan for this zone, for these zones, that sets the 12-month deadline would set a good standard that the council enforcement procedures could be enacted against should this be required. So just to reinforce that again, just saying that I think the planner's report states that that doesn't need to be the timeline put into the performance conditions. We believe that would be a useful thing. It states it up front. It's clear what's required, and as I said, it would perhaps make it more easy to enforce in the unlikely case that that should happen. So we would argue that it's difficult to justify the financial imposition and the impacts of a bond in this situation. If in the other zones in the New Plymouth Council area, this won't be applied, which is what we've seen for some of the other zones. So, equally, in many other council areas around New Zealand, we don't see that councils have seen fit to have a financial bond imposed when this money could rightfully be used to complete any reinstatement works required in the report. We think that that's a much better use of the money and more likely to result in a quicker reinstatement of what is required for the building. As a final note, again, we're pleased to see that note in the report that says that there are storage yards for houses and buildings in this zone. They are exempt from the activity standards that would otherwise be specified for permanently relocated buildings. So we're pleased to see that clarified in the planner's report. So that's a quick summary of our position on this, and yeah, welcome any questions.
David, questions?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Barnett-Thompson. Just a clarification to one of the first matters that you raised, and that is about the role of residential in these central city type zones. We actually heard yesterday that the role of residential is quite a critical role. It may not necessarily involve the removal of the transportation of dwellings, but residential as an activity is seen as quite a critical role. So wasn't sure whether you were listening in yesterday to hear that thing. Okay,
no, I hadn't picked up on that. Is this like an apartment style living or something different?
Well, it could be apartment style. It could be mixed use with commercial on the ground floor, residential above, or it could be standalone residentials. We so Burn drew our attention to a development by, I think it was the Soho Group yesterday, which is in the mixed use zone, which is I think 50 odd apartment style buildings, developments, townhouse type developments being developed in conjunction with Kaingora, I believe. So that was in the mixed use zone. So a new build. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked into that in detail, but I think there were some zones where the planning controls on relocated wasn't permitted, but that may have been a different control. I can't quite recall off the top of my head. Yeah.
When you say some zones, are you talking about the 4 commercial zones that we're talking with?
Yeah.
And so your concerns equally apply to each zone, or are you focusing specifically on one or t'other of the zones?
I think the mixed zones are the ones that probably are more likely. I think you'll have to excuse me, I can't quite remember. I think the more city centre ones were less likely to be used, I guess, for a relocation of a commercial building, just due to the scale and the size. Not that any of my members would be adverse to shifting a large building, as I think we might have talked about before.
Yes.
But I think it's less likely. Yeah.
I mean, my skim through the track change version of the Council 42A report suggests that the new rule, relocation of a building as a permitted activity with those 3 criteria, has been carried across on all of the zones. So could I just get Lauren? Could you just confirm that I'm correct there?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Good.
All zones are the same.
Yes, that's what I thought. So your concern, Jonathan, is with the particularly item 2, the relocation bond that's required to be paid.
Yeah,
that's your principal concern.
Yeah, I think that's why we identified that we did want to present before you today, is just to reinforce our opposition to that.
Yes.
As I said, we think there are other ways of making sure that the reinstatement works are carried out.
Yes. If that bond is not paid, then the activity status is no longer permitted. Was that how you understood it? And the activity status changes to restricted discretionary. So
yes, I guess that would be right. Yeah, it does. Yeah,
yes.
that the application wouldn't comply with the performance conditions.
Yes.
Yeah.
So all 3 standards have to be complied with to be a permitted activity. Yes. I can recall your evidence in relation to the industrial zones, and I think there was also some evidence in relation to the open space zones also on this issue. what is it about the bond itself? Is it how it's calculated, or are you just saying it's just not needed? What's
I think
the concern there?
Okay, so it's a variety of effects, really. So in general, people are choosing to relocate a building or a home because it's more a cost-efficient way of doing so. And what we would be concerned about is the messaging that this sends to people in this situation, that not only do you have to front up for the land, for the building, for the reinstatement works, but then you have to pay the council a bond for the I think it was equal to the value of the reinstatement works, for the extra cost. And we're worried about the messaging that this might send to put people off to actually say, okay, well, maybe it's easier because there's no bond required on a new build. Maybe I'll just do that instead.
Okay. So that's your position on bonds is across all zones within the district plan. It just doesn't relate to these zones or the industrial zone.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Through you, Mr. Chair, I guess, and it's a question I probably should have asked Lauren yesterday, and that is, there just seems to be an inconsistency, potential inconsistency here between, say, the industrial zones and the open space zones recommendation and the central city zones. I'm not saying one zone is more sensitive than the other, although I think Jonathan's conceded that industrial zones are more robust. But if you compare the open space zones and the some of the central city zones, they both have amenity considerations, and it seems that the application of the bond has been applied differently between those two sets of zones. So I was just wondering if she's in a position now, Lauren, whether you're able to comment on that, or whether you want to reserve your comment on the right of reply on that matter.
I am in a position now where I can advise you what my recommendation will be. So I wasn't aware that in her right of reply for the general industrial zone that Ms. Gibson had signalled that the requirement for a bond will be removed across all zones. So I'm likely to recommend that bond comes off, but that reinstatement report
Okay.
that stays in there because of trying to keep our commercial and mixed use zones having good amenity there.
So sorry, I just missed that. It will come off and where and stay where?
So I'm likely to recommend removing the bond, but keeping the reinstatement report there for the sake of keeping good amenity in our commercial and mixed use zones.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification, Lauren. Jonathan, how does that sit with you then?
Listen, that would sit with us quite nicely. As I said, we're more than happy for the reinstatement report. We think that's a better way of identifying those things that need to be reinstated and getting the owner of the building onto basically undertaking those works, whatever is listed there. So
yes,
very happy with that. Yeah, and as you've identified the consistency, I think we've got the rural zones coming up next, and I think that's also where no bond has been applied. So it would make sense really to have that consistency across the zones.
Thank you. That was all from me, Jonathan. Over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, well done, David, for taking us through that. That's really good. And Jonathan, I don't have any further questions. Really appreciate your attendance and your involvement in these hearings. It's very important, I think, that we're all looking at making these plans as user-friendly and as clear as possible. So yes, we'll take on board the discussion we've just had now, and we'll hear back from Lauren and a right of reply. So thank you very much.
That's lovely. Thanks again for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Okay,
thanks.
Thank you. Right, we're moving to Helen Duncan now for Lampro Limited. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me
Good
now?
morning. Morning, Helen. We can hear you. Yes.
Good.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
Again, we've read your evidence,
Yes.
so just perhaps just give us the highlights to introduce us before we have some questions.
Great, of course, yes. So there were 2 points we had 2 submission points relating to this hearing. The first related to the city centre zone and the demolition of buildings. And I just refer you to paragraph 12 of my evidence there. I just wanted to clarify a point I made there around why a site might be vacant for a period of time. And I've referred there to finalising and seeking consents for a replacement building. And by that, I mean the suite of consents that may be required under either the RMA or the Building Act or the NES contaminated sites. So I wanted to just clarify that I wasn't just referring there to RMA requirements and district plan requirements. So in terms of our actual point of submission there, I've referred there to the practical implications in paragraph 13 of the permitted activity status for this activity, which could present problems for the council to administer without the additional wording that we've sought there. So I really think our submission point there is around just making this rule quite clear, and in terms of how it's written without that cross-referencing back to policy that's referred to in the section 42A report. Did you want me to pause there or just carry on? That was all I wanted to say around that submission point.
I think just carry on, Helen, and we'll pick up questions. Yeah.
Perfect. So our second submission point was around business service activities in the mixed use zone. So I'm sitting here today at 57 Vivian Street, which is the Land Pro offices, which is proposed to be within the mixed use zone. And as it stands, we and similar business service activities would become non-complying. Now, obviously, we enjoy existing use rights, but I've made a point there in the evidence that it's really about supporting growth and recognising the role of business service activities in a mixed use zone. And I've, in my evidence, provided a map at Appendix B, and unfortunately that map has not reproduced well. I did yesterday provide to the admin, Christine, thank you so much, a copy of that map, which is now on the screen. Yes. And that was just our analysis of the mixed use zone as proposed around us, with the blue dots on this map identifying which would be business service activities, and therefore under the definition which I've provided there in the box, would be non-complying. And it's really to give you an overview of what's kind of happening in this zone. And I've pointed out there are a couple of sort of key features in terms of other agencies that are around this area, such as the courthouse and police. So you get a whole collection of sort of business support services, if you like, around them. So I point out things like lawyers, ourselves, insurance, the council itself, which is a government agency, so would get caught under this definition as well, and things like veterinary services, all of which have enjoy this great transport links that we have here in this mixed use zone as it's proposed. So that was the only points I really wanted to clarify there. I'm happy to take questions.
Yes, Helen, I'll move to David, but thanks so much for getting this image through to us and anticipating we'd want to ask you for a clarification. So well caught. I'll just hand over to David for questions he may have.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Duncan. The Central City Rule 12, as you quite rightly pointed out, the the recommendation from the 42A officer is not to adopt the relief sought in terms of the additional words that you've added. And I wondered whether part of that reason might be that the additional words involve an element of discretion in terms of not defining exactly what the time period is. You refer to a period of time for establishment of another building, and that's pretty open-ended. I just wondered whether you've, having seen the 42A report and written your evidence, whether you thought that rule could be refined or nuanced so as to provide a time frame, albeit that it's going to be arbitrary, but at least to give a little bit more certainty to that rule that might be then more looked at more favourably by the 42A officer.
Yes, I think that I have had a chance to reflect on that since, and I do agree that there is an element of discretion. Having reflected on it and from the experience of consent requirements, I was thinking a period of 3 months would be useful, and it would give a good measurable time period. So if we were looking for 3 months, that was an option.
Okay. I don't suppose you've had a chance to have a look at other practice around the country in terms of this issue and what sort of metrics they use?
I haven't. No, I haven't looked at the metrics, but I do know this is an issue which a lot of councils
Yes.
do grapple with. So
Yes,
yes.
I mean, I'm from Christchurch and Wellington. Both those local authorities have that sort of rule to prevent vacant sites occurring and for long periods of time. It just strikes me that 3 months might be on the short side in terms of getting the necessary consents in place for an alternative use of the site. Just in terms of going through a consenting process and with the possibility of notification and third-party appeals.
Yes, that's true.
But I guess that does have to be balanced against the amenity that would be affected by that period. So it's a balancing act, I guess. I guess all I'm signaling is that there is. It would be preferable to have a time frame established, but one that isn't too short but not too long also, that it creates issues that it's seeking to avoid in the first place.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know if I can take that any further, and it'd be interested to see what Lauren's got to say on that, and whether there's an opportunity for further discussion offline on that.
Yeah.
As to the second matter, I'm just a little bit confused about that matter in the mixed use zone. Can you just take me through what you're seeking there?
So as it stands with the rules as written, business service activities, which include, I'll run through it. Sorry, I have got it in the evidence. Which includes offices for businesses, local and government agencies, community entities, professional services, e.g. lawyers, accountants, engineering, surveying. So I know I won't go through it, it's quite a long list. But the issue that the activity status drops from commercial activities being permitted through to business service activities being non-compliant. So it seems like a really big jump for something that is actually quite compatible through the effect standards that are being placed in the plan to be managed, to then go through it from have a very strong activity status of non-complying. So that's really what we're seeking, to align it better with commercial services. And that's similar to what I have said. I did do a little bit more research on this one, and I've mentioned in the Porirua proposed district plan and how they've dealt with business services. So we're seeking sort of similar alignment, although recognising that the New Plymouth District Plan has its own structure and definitions.
Yes. Are they, I was going to ask you, is business services, is that a national planning standard definition or is it a district plan definition?
I'm unsure.
Okay. But the solution is to make specific provision for commercial services. Is that what you're saying?
To make business services permitted, yeah.
Business. Okay, and that results, that's a deletion of Rule 17 in the mixed use zone, is it? And the addition of a new business service activity as a permitted activity.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, again, I guess we need to hear back from Lauren. We heard yesterday from a couple of economists and retail specialists talking about the importance of commercial offices and some aspects of business services and leading the recovery in the central zones. But I'm not sure whether that was in relation to the mixed use zone. I'll need to check my notes on that.
Okay.
That was all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I just had one question of interest, Helen. Hey, is your offices, are they in a house or?
No, they're
built.
yes. It was previously another business, and Landpro moved in a few years ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so in your plan, the red areas they're mainly commercial business buildings rather than house conversions, or is there a mixture?
There's a mixture, I would say. Yeah, there is a mixture, which is totally makes sense in terms of it being a mixed use zone.
Okay.
Yep.
No, thank you. I don't have any other questions. Really appreciate your attendance, Helen. And,
thank you.
We'll hear back from Lauren in due course when she does her verbal right of reply today, and I think we'll see a written right of reply in a couple of weeks. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right, thank you for that. We're now moving to Sarah from Z Energy Limited. Welcome, Sarah.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, should I just kick off, or is there anything you'd like to say?
No,
Yep.
I think the floor is yours. Thank you, Sarah. We have read your evidence. So
Yep.
as we've sort of asked for, just a bit of a highlights package and take us through the main points, and then we'll move to questions.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you to the panel, and thank you, Stephen Dash, for this opportunity. Appreciate it. Z Energy, and therefore my evidence, really only covers two outstanding points, those being the city centre zone standard 2, which is the pedestrian frontage control, and the mixed use zone standard 4, which is the requirement to plant trees along a road frontage. So I'll start with city centre zone. So I've recommended that the city centre zone standard 2 is amended by including another exception to the rule, so that the existing service station on Courtney Street is not required to comply with the standard. And as I pointed out in my evidence, there's already an exception in this standard for heritage buildings. I consider that this change will recognise the functional and operational requirements of the existing service station without requiring what I consider to be unnecessary resource consent application in some circumstances. Limiting this proposed exclusion to the specific service station activity means that in future, if a new development or new use on the site were to be proposed, they would still need to reasonably factor in and consider the standard into their design to achieve the outcomes so as sought by the plan. On top of that, I consider that it's further complicated by the proposed inclusion of the word planned into the policy framework insofar as you're assessing an application against the environment. I think that was an addition sought by Kainga Ora, and one which was recommended by the 42A officer to be included. This policy direction I see could lead a plan user to considering the application in a policy sense only to that future scenario. So if planned is included, an assessment for, as an example, an assessment of an activity for maintenance or upgrade of the service station against that policy framework may well conclude that the application is contrary to that policy framework, because the service station in its current operation will not achieve that standard. And it's Z Energy's experience, and indeed my own, that this can create significant difficulties in the processing of a resource consent application. Yeah, so just in summary, so I think that it's appropriate for an exclusion-based relief sought to the standard, which will avoid the policy issue I've raised, but also address the concern raised by the 42A officer, in that they're looking to protect that future design outcome of the city centre zone road. Moving on to mixed use zone standard 4, which requires trees to be planted a particular length apart on the frontage of a mixed use zone. I also consider this could be amended by another exception to the rule in the same vein. However, it doesn't necessarily need to be the address-based example from the previous, but it could just be service stations in general. Overall, service stations have a significant number of traffic movements into and out of the sites per day. Visibility of the forecourt and to the associated signage is critical to a safe and efficient operation. And so the standard requiring trees to be planted that will become substantial over time can create nuisance both commercially and in terms of route extent. Z Energy's experience is that this can raise integrity issues for underground infrastructure, which can contain hazardous substances or drainage systems to control the same, and associated health and safety concerns for contamination and or road and footpath users based on limited visibility. In that space, I'm also open to considering and having a discussion about the alternative relief as suggested in my evidence, which is to provide a little bit more scope to enable such users to design landscaping so that visibility is better achieved. The outcome of which I consider will minimize the degree of nuisance and any health and safety effects caused by that standard. The specific relief can be found in section 8 of my evidence, so I won't repeat them. Two other points I'd just like to make beyond those 2 points of my evidence is that I have read the statements of other submitters, and I wasn't here yesterday, apologies, but I do agree with the point raised in section 4.6 of Michael Campbell's evidence statement on behalf of Kainga Ora. Whilst I appreciate this may have been done yesterday, I do agree that it would be useful if the planner could confirm the intent behind standards mixed use zone S4 for the landscaping on the front boundary and mixed use zone S3, which speaks to building setbacks. However, there is no front boundary standard in terms of a building setback, and how those two work together. This was probably discussed yesterday. Finally, I'd just like to touch on section 32AA, whilst my evidence, I didn't specifically include section 32 RMA analysis and headings of the same. Evidently, I addressed each of the matters required for such an analysis in my evidence, and if it would help the room and the panel today, I'm happy to speak to that. I also have a couple of pages prepared addressing some costs and benefits and efficiencies of the relief sought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yeah, there's a big echo coming back to me. Can anyone else hear that?
You're clear now, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of primary things, Sarah. Yes, if you've got those notes prepared about the costs and benefits, section 32AA of aspects, to send them through to Christine, and that will just close that loop for us. So thank you for that, and we'll have a look at that. And the other thing is, I wonder whether we'll get David to ask some questions, but whether we could actually just bring up the site on the planning maps or the Zoom, sorry, the Google Maps, Christine, just so we can focus on sites, and then we can talk around the actual site issues itself. Sarah answers questions. It's Courtney Street, isn't it, Sarah?
Correct, the corner site.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go back. Right.
Are you trying to do street view as well?
I'm just trying to do.
Yeah.
We could to actually see the aerial photo, perhaps rather than the zoning.
You can,
Here we go.
drag it to the right.
So is that the site there, Sarah?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just with that in front of us, hand over to David, and he can ask some questions if he has some.
Yes, good morning, Ms. Westerby. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. I'm just orientating myself on this. Is there anything you want to draw our attention to on this aerial before I go to questions?
Just specifically that it's not Courtney Street frontage to the south of this aerial. It's to the west. The western line is where the pedestrian frontage overlay and therefore standard applies. So it's on the western boundary.
Western boundary, not the south.
Correct.
South.
Where this boundary here is the main road to which this pedestrian design outcome is sought through the plan.
Okay. I'm getting a little bit of echo. I don't know if anyone else is getting that.
Perhaps it's if I mute.
Okay, let's try that, and you can come on when you're ready to answer. So I guess what I'm trying to understand, Mr. Westerby, is the scenarios in which both standards, particularly standard 2 in the central city zone, would be triggered. So there's the status quo scenario where the Z Energy site is lawfully established and operating currently. That current operation and the continuation of it's unaffected by the standard, is it not?
I agree. The current operation with no changes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the second scenario where the standard might come into play is if Z Energy decided to reimagine or redevelop the site or upgrade the site for its current operation. So new branding, new forecourts, new access ways, those sort of things, new convenient, presumably there's a convenience store on the site, is there?
Yeah, shop, yeah.
Yes, a shop, yes, yes. And it's fully serviced, is it? It's not a unmanned facility.
Correct. They're staffed. It's staffed. Yeah.
Staffed, yes, yeah. So that second scenario could involve some repositioning, and there would that standard then would be triggered. Is that you understand?
That's my experience and my understanding of how I would read the interpretation of that standard. Even if something is a permitted activity by a rule, if you're introducing something different to the site in terms of its appearance, could be as trivial as a sign that looks different. Are you triggering the need to consider the building and design standards as part of that? Or it may be a permitted activity.
Yes.
And that's where the confusion can lie in terms of interpretation of these sorts of standards.
Yes. And so the requirement to remain permitted along that western boundary would be items such as providing verandas, having transparent glazing on the shop, a principal public entrance road from the road boundary, storage areas being located to the rear of buildings, and no vehicle access points across the road boundary. So it seems that they would be quite difficult matters to accommodate given the function and form of a service station.
That's my point exactly. Not only quite difficult, but they wouldn't do that for operational, functional and safety reasons. As I mentioned earlier, being able to view a forecourt and have presence of the fact that as a driver, the fact that you need to brake soon, where are the access points? How is this going to be safely accommodated in my vehicle, as an example, and also seeing the price, really important. So all those sorts of things, it just wouldn't happen. So my point is that I don't know if it's a useful resource consent application process to go through.
Yes. Hence,
I wonder in this situation that it could be appropriate for a site-specific and use-specific exception to the rule.
Mm-hmm. Can you just remind me of the activity status where standard 2 is not complied with?
I don't know off the top of my head. I would assume a restricted discretionary activity, but I'd have to check that.
Lauren, can you just confirm that?
Thank you, Lauren.
So it comes from the activity status up above.
Yes,
So
is
the
it
activity that sets the activity status, then you must meet the criteria down below in the effect standards.
Yes.
I'm just going to zoom up and see
Is
what service stations would be. So they'll be commercial service activities, so they would, it's just discretionary outright.
Which is that rule 8, is it?
8, yes.
So they're discretionary anyway.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yes. Does that change things for you, Ms. Westerby? I mean, it sounds like you're going to need, Z Energy would need a consent,
Yep.
regardless of the pedestrian frontage issue.
Yeah, it's a matter of, I think it's a matter of principle. So what we find is that even when you're applying for consent for an activity, if it indeed is agreed to trigger the activity by reason of a change of something on the site, often, in my experience, the application is questioned around why is the application not achieving the standards, and I don't necessarily think that's a useful question and a useful scenario in this particular circumstance.
Albeit in this case, the activity status would be fully discretionary for the changes to the service station as opposed to a restricted discretionary
Yeah,
for the
yeah,
pedestrian
so,
rule.
yeah, accepting that an application would need to be applied for. Well, my point is that it's my experience very recently in a very similar scenario that questions are raised around the fact that the proposal is not achieving a particular outcome, and that is then muddied by my reference to the policy framework.
Okay, I'll come back to the policy framework in a moment.
Yeah,
Third scenario that obviously could occur is if Z Energy decided to quit the site and sell it, and it was developed for an alternative use. Your expectation is that that pedestrian frontage rule should apply to that use presumably, and hence that's why you're seeking an exemption only for the activity that's currently established.
that's correct, because I agree with the principle of the frontage and what it seeks to achieve.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's understand all that. The reference to plan character and the matters over which discretion is restricted. This term has had a sort of a bit of longevity to it, and it's come through from some of the interim guidance from the panel on the strategic objectives, and I think most of the 42 officers have started retrofitting the policy provisions to refer to plan character, and hence that's possibly why the matter of discretion exists there. Stephen, did you want to come in on that point? You're probably across it more than I am.
Yes, that's really come from quite a lot of discussion we had at the strategic objectives hearing, Sarah, kind of looking back at the MPS UD and those sorts of requirements, and certainly a favoured term at a strategic directions level by the panel. So I think that, David, you're right. That's probably the origin of that.
Yes.
And but it does. I can sort of understand Sarah's point that the plan character around some of these amenity rules just is unrealistic for a long term and a sort of activity site that falls within the sorts of activities which are anticipated by the plan. An issue. So that's my just my comment there, David.
Yes, thank you for that. I guess Ms. Westerby, the whole issue, both on terms of standard 2 and standard 4, comes down to whether it's good planning practice to provide for one-off exemptions, or whether it's better to allow the argument to be made at the time of the resource consent, and where the argument is one that's simply made that form and function doesn't readily allow the standard to be met, or the form and function is never going to be consistent with the plan character and amenity of the city because the use is a long established one, lawfully established, and the application is just for some tweaks or for a rebranding of the existing activity. And I'm not trying to say that blithely, because as a practitioner, I understand the need to try and avoid consent processes where possible. But in this case, the fully discretionary activity status of a service station in the central city zone, at least, means you're never going to be able to avoid that consent for anything other than some very minor tweaks that might fall within the realms of the existing consent. So I just that's a very principled question, but I just wondered if you've got a response to that.
Yeah, thank you, David. I equally appreciate where you're coming from, and to a degree, totally agree with you. The point that I and Z Energy would, while we're here today, is just to share and have that potential process considered by the room. And hence, you know, the relief recommended is simply relief recommended
Yes.
to avoid the scenario that we deal with very often. And what I guess the point is that we'd like it established, and I guess it is for the record, that, you know, the activity is lawful, but as soon as anything is changed on that site, existing use rights, in my experience anyway, don't apply, and the plan is considered. So resource consent would need to be applied for, and the relevant, all standards should be considered in that application in any event, and the policies. And so the combination of the factors don't necessarily lend itself to a favourable processing outcome. And I'd just like it noted for the record that it can turn into a complex conversation often. And I wondered whether in this situation, because of where this site is at the end of the pedestrian frontage for the benefit of the room does not continue south of this intersection. So it is the end of the line. So combining those factors together, I'd still suggest it's an appropriate outcome as an exclusion-based use in this scenario. In particular, I do highlight that an exclusion outcome is not a novel endeavour by this plan as heritage buildings, where, you know, a heritage building you'd expect not to have the same design standards as other buildings. In this case, the specific use on the site, I'd expect a service station not to achieve the same outcomes as all other buildings for a temporary time. Yeah.
That's interesting. Sorry, I'm still getting some feedback. Okay, that sounds better. Based on that, I wonder whether the solution is therefore at the policy or matters of discretion level, as opposed to seeking exemptions. Given that you're going to have to lodge a resource consent anyway, even if it's not under that rule, if it's under the commercial services rule, and whether there's an ability within the scope of the submission from Z Energy to, I don't want to speak too colloquial, but create some slack to recognise existing environments when considering activities. Your reference to plan character, was it in relation to the matters of discretion, or was it in a policy scenario? I think it was the latter, wasn't it?
Mostly the latter, when you're turning your mind to objectives and policies solely. Because for a discretionary activity, you would be putting perhaps a bit more weight on those policies in your 104. I would a relief sought in other processes is in terms of a matter of discretion or equivalent, a note or a matter suggesting the other scenario is where there's a operational functional requirement not to achieve. So the degree to which the extent to which there's a functional or operational requirement to not achieve a particular standard. And that is something that we've offered and had success throughout the country in. Can't think of one off the top of my head, but there are examples.
That's precisely what I was driving at, even though I rather clumsily put it. I just wondered whether there's some opportunity for you and Ms. O'Byrne to discuss that offline, and on a without prejudice basis, obviously. And we've seen some policy assistance for operational functional matters in other chapters of the plan. And if there's an appetite for that, I'm sure we can provide that opportunity.
I would happily have a separate conversation with Lauren or anyone about including or the, you know, whether it's palatable to include a reference to operational or functional requirements, either in a policy sense or a matter of discretion.
Discretion. Yep. Okay. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time, and I'll hand over to you, Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Just a couple of questions. The first one is, can you just talk us through the most recent issue you've had, where it is, what the facts were in terms of the case you cited causing grief, I suppose, for the want of a better word?
Yeah, which one? Okay. In Waitaki, there's two. I can't remember the first one, which is a better example because it's purely landscaping. This complexity more aligns with the mixed-use zone landscaping requirement rather than a pedestrian frontage requirement. Similar complexities though. There's a landscaping buffer on the road frontage of a site. Z Energy were seeking to install a diesel emission fluid tank in that landscaping buffer. We applied for resource consent accordingly because of the activity status discretionary, I believe. And the question arose from the council during the processing, why are you, something like, why are you not achieving the landscaping outcomes? Bear in mind, it was an existing truck stop that had a very narrow strip of existing landscaping, definitely not 10 metres. In fact, there were pumps and fill points already within that 10 metres, but the standard that's sitting in the plan currently versus what's being proposed, it didn't seem to be a reasonable analysis of the existing environment insofar as they're assessing the questions for their further information request. So we have our existing environment lawfully established. You've got your plan standards, but we felt that there wasn't necessarily due regard to that existing environment. And it complicates the process often. We tend to, for lack of a better phrase, tend to have a fight on our hands just for installing a small building, in their front yard, but there wasn't one to begin with. That's the example.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just struggling with my mute system here. Thanks for that. Look, I think certainly we're encouraging where there's sort of some practice issues that we talk about around some of these sorts of functional needs matters for the 42A planner for council and the planner representing to have some discussions. I don't think they need to be off the record. They can be had and just recorded in Lauren's reply. You may or may not agree, but I think that's a great planning practice through these processes. Sarah, you're obviously very experienced with the service station functional needs requirements, so certainly encourage that if Lauren can facilitate that with you, Sarah. It's just a one-on-one discussion. Yes, and I think, yeah, that's probably, I don't have any other questions. I think we thoroughly understand the issue, and there are always exceptions to the rule when you're having these sorts of zones which are established. We are seeking sort of significant amenity provisions through standards. I think David's well covered, or David and you have well covered the discussions here, and I know Lauren will be listening in pretty closely too. So that's all from us. And if you can, we're really quite interested in the section sort of 32AA, the realistic, with your experience just setting out where you see the matters in the 32A, including costs and benefits. Just get that through to us, and Christine will get it to Lauren, and we'll go from there.
Great, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sarah. David, did you have another question? No, he's all good. Right. We now have Sarah Mako for Kotahitanga o Te Atiawa. Sarah.
Tēnā tātou, morena.
Morena. How are you guys doing with COVID and everything else? Is the team all okay?
Yeah. So our kaima here, some of our staff and whānau were affected, so we're all on the mend there.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you though. Yeah, definitely a really tricky time and interesting as well. So just out of interest, I was at the same event that some of the some of our kaimahi were affected, and I've returned 3 negative tests. So yeah, really interesting. But
I've got 2 university kids who are in flats with COVID positive people. Just found out in the last couple of days. So I think a lot of young people are getting it this time around in terms of transmissibility, and kids in university hostels and things. It's quite a different demographic, perhaps than previously. But yeah, we're all pleased that everyone's in our sort of zone of contact at the moment in this hearing. It's so far seems to be okay. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. So Sarah, you were listening in on and off yesterday, so you've probably got the gist of where those discussions were heading. And we do have your evidence, and we have read it, and just as usual, just a highlights package, and then we'll go into questions.
yeah, sure. So so don't be fooled again by me sitting on the hearing. Had an afternoon of phone calls while I was logged on, so have listened here and there. But anyway, this morning I just shared with Christine and Julie. I've written some speaking notes, so I am going to speak to them.
Yes, right. We will just open those up, and you can just take us through those, Sarah. I've got those online here. Yeah,
cool. So they are much longer than what I expected them to be, but anyway, once I started. So anyway, I'll just take you through those. Okay. So kia ora kōrua, ngā mihi nui kia kōrua, Lauren, Richard, and Christine, tēnā koutou, and all of everyone else online. So my evidence to hearing 16 traverses a lot of information provided at previous hearings. I wanted to touch on only 2 matters briefly today: achieving good quality design and the planned character / outcome / role / urban form in the commercial and mixed use zones. Commissioner Dash yesterday asked Mr. Bain, who decides what is good design? I acknowledge that design is an expertise in its own right, and that must be respected. However, in my opinion, good design is the product of good process. Good design cannot be undertaken by one set of expertise by itself. Otherwise, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Good design process must be mana enhancing for all parties. That is, the values and expertise of many are respected and represented. In the context of the city centre, I consider good design must be considered from a community scale. That is, if the city centre is the cultural and economic hub of the district, the design process and subsequent built form within that area must benefit from a variety of expertise that make up our community. As mentioned in my statement of evidence to hearing 16, the KD Holdings Limited proposed building is, in my opinion, a product of good design because of the process that was followed and the values that are represented in the look, orientation and function of the building. In that process, we asked ourselves, and I refer to us as a we in this because I assisted with the cultural impact assessment with Ngāti Te Whiti. So we asked ourselves, what would a kui or koro from Ngāti Te Whiti be able to talk to if she stood in front of that building? We also asked ourselves, what will our tamariki and mokopuna see when they walk past that building, and what will that tell them in turn about their place in this community? Similarly, the applicant was asking himself, what is a positive legacy he could leave for this community through the construction of this building? These questions and the expertise of multiple parties led to the outcome I am personally excited to see constructed, and a representation of Mawhera physically being back in the city landscape and the prominence of the Huatoki restored. Good quality design and well-functioning urban environments will benefit from the expertise of tangata whenua and the relationship and culture and traditions of tangata whenua with Te Taiao. I appreciate the mahi koanga order, particularly Mr. Ray, has undertaken to inform the proposed height limits. I personally do not view height as necessarily being bad or always generating adverse landscape effects. I agree with Mr. Ray's comments yesterday that in relation to tall buildings, it is about the response, the context of the wider response, the local environment and the streetscape. As mentioned, in my opinion, it is also about the process of design and the expertise engaged, including that of tangata whenua, and a full understanding of the elements of the existing environment understood. That understanding of the existing environment must include the nature of the relationship of tangata whenua with the area to be recognised and provided for. I have noted in my evidence that neither the Central City Heritage Character Area Statement nor the City and the Town Centre Design Guide have benefited from the expertise of tangata whenua. The City and Town Centre Design Guide highlights the Inglewood Railway Station. Sorry, this is as an example. The design guide highlights the Inglewood Railway Station as being one of the deferred selection properties for Te Atiawa. This is correct. Te Kotaitanga o Te Atiawa also own the Atkinson building, which is 6 stories in height, and the courthouse, which is 2 stories in height, both within the city centre zone, and the police station, which is 3 stories within the mixed use zone. Education House at 41 to 47 Elliott Street, which Mr. Ray highlighted yesterday, is 6 stories with a lift / stairwell addition. It is within the mixed use zone, and it is also a DSP that Te Kotaitanga has given notice to the Crown of their interest in the property. So I've just highlighted those as other examples within the design guide that haven't been referenced, and obviously some of them are tall buildings as well. So Atkinson building as well. So I'm not a very good member, but I paddle for one of the local Wakaama clubs, and so we paddled up and down, both ways up and down the coast. So actually the Atkinson building from the sea is actually one of the most visible buildings as well. So I think it's really important that that's also taken into consideration, that environment as well.
Sarah, is that the building Mr. Ray showed us near the Worley building? No. Richard, just remind, yeah.
The Atkinson building is opposite the Lenlai Centre.
Okay.
Directly opposite.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the courthouse is behind that.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah.
So Education House is, how would you describe it? It's on the corner of Elliott Street in one of the one-ways.
Yep, we know that one well.
Yep.
Yep.
So also the design guide states the Pukeariki landscape is difficult to discern today because it has substantially disappeared beneath the confluence of streets of what is now the commercial city of the centre. My question is, Pukeariki is difficult to discern from whose perspective? I understand the height of Pukeariki Museum, the building, represents the original height of Pukeariki Pa, a modern recontextualisation and reimagination of the ancestral lands of Ngāti Te Whiti and Te Atiawa. In addition, the Robe Street Conservation Area, which is the reserve area outside the New Plymouth Courthouse, is an area known as Maramamao, the largest cultivation area on the outer reaches of the Pa. So Maramamao was the largest cultivation area, but that open space area in front of the courthouse is the only remaining remnant of that open space. Whilst the landscape of Pukeariki may be difficult to discern physically, there is the ability to reimagine, recontextualise and restore Pukeariki in the landscape using, for example, applied cultural expression. This leads me to my second point in regard to plan character / outcomes / roles / urban form in the commercial and mixed use zones. I consider that how the plan outcomes, character, roles, urban form are and or will be articulated in the proposed district plan is a policy gap that will rely on the objectives and policies of the specific zones and the city and town centre design guide. At paragraph 39 of my evidence, I agree with Kainga Order that the planned character in the commercial and mixed zones should be considered rather than fixed. However, I consider that planned outcomes or planned character in relation to Te Ao Māori, including tikanga and Mātauranga Māori, are not well formed explicit in the commercial and mixed use zones. This, in my view, elevates the need for good design process to determine the planned outcomes in the context of the day. Now, these next couple of paragraphs are in my evidence, but I would just like to read them out as well. I think they are key. In response to the planned character of zones in relation to Te Ao Māori, including tikanga and Mātauranga Māori, at paragraph 40 of my evidence, I set out that, based on the advice of Hapu and my own experience, it is my opinion that Māori and our culture is not fixed. We are not static and we continue to evolve to meet the current context of the day. We are forward thinking and projecting, and whilst we continue to acknowledge and respect the past, we refuse to be bound by our past experiences. With respect to applied cultural expression, at paragraph 41 of my evidence, I stated, I describe applied cultural expression as is not art or necessarily for entertainment value. Applied cultural expression includes, but is not limited to toi, so art, rongoa, medicine, rāranga, weaving, moko, and facilities which enable an active relationship with place, amongst others. Applied cultural expression is giving life to our cultural realities to reintroduce tongi and tohu and markers into the landscape, both bold and subtle, to guide our mokopuna and provide inspiration for them to aspire to. I consider that these elements are fundamental in considering the planned character for the district, and the depth of these must be reflected in the provisions of this plan, specifically the design guides, and in the matters of control or discretion. Applied cultural expression is a contemporary way in which the relationship of Māori with the ancestral lands, waters, sites, wahi tapu, and other taonga can be recognised and provided for. Development, use and activities within the commercial and mixed use zones have an important role in realising these applied cultural expressions on a case-by-case basis. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sarah, and you continue to be a bit of a gold standard in terms of a witness. Time you've taken to reflect and sort of focus this down after you've heard from some of the discussion is really good. So your speaking notes summarise key points, and you're homing in on the sort of the nub of the issue. So really appreciate that. It takes a bit of time to put these things together as you're on the roll. So just want to acknowledge you for doing that. I'll just hand over to David for any questions he may have.
Thanks, Stephen. Good morning, Sarah.
Hilda.
You can hear me okay? I take it? Good. I've been having some trouble with my microphone this morning. three matters from me. The first is in respect to the rezoning request for 41 to 47 Elliott Street.
Mhm.
Presumably, you'll be speaking to that in further detail at the rezoning hearing.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
And I haven't read all of it, but did catch part of Mr. Ray's presentation yesterday around the potential extent of the living precinct as well. So that's something we'll be
Yes.
definitely exploring.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'll reserve questions to that hearing. The second two matters were, and I'm focusing here on your Appendix 1 to your evidence,
Mhm.
which you've usefully coloured up in blue and red text. And particularly, well, the first policy is policy 8, but the changes that you're seeking to policy 8 are changes that you're also seeking to the other commercial zones, the equivalent policies, aren't you? And essentially, if it's clause 5 each time, or the equivalent of clause 5
Mhm.
relating to the policy direction for additions and alterations in central city, town centre, local centre, and
Mhm.
mixed use zones.
Mhm.
Okay, and you have a wording preference that's different from the wording preference of Lauren's in terms of clause 5.
Mhm.
And Lauren's recommended the addition of the words "the outcomes of any engagement and consultation with tangata whenua as cultural experts on," and then it carries on. Can you tell us why you think that is not sufficient, and why the wording that you've proposed and read is preferable and a more appropriate policy direction?
So this is something that so when I say we, so both Maria and I for Te Kahui as well have actually traversed in, I think, almost all of the hearings since hearing 9. And it was about providing that clarity to plan users around engaging the expertise of tangata whenua as an expert, and it's come out of some of the revised policy wording for the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity chapter, particularly around the engagement of the expertise of the ecologist, to the ecologist and tangata whenua to inform the identification of those significant natural areas. So was just looking for some wording that was consistent across the entire plan. So definitely not wedded to that wording. It's something it's something I've pulled through in all of my evidence to the recent chapters. So
yes. So is the wording that's in this example of policy 8, clause 5, is that wording different from the wording in the submission, the original submission lodged by Te Atiawa?
yes.
Okay. So what was the wording in the original submission?
Ooh, I think from memory, I don't have that open on my screen right now, but what Lauren has done in this for the section 42A recommendations for this chapter, and also what the other section 42A report writers have done, is they've actually done what we asked them to do, and
Yes.
what the Te Koteitanga submission points raised.
Yes.
So that it's not only limited to consultation, and that actually engagement is the preference
yes.
over consultation. So
yes.
it's just an expansion of that wording, in my opinion, from that submission.
Okay, thank you for that. And as you say, that carries through on all of those policies in the 5 zones. Okay. Then the second and last question I had was in relation to and again, this is something this is an addition of a new matter of discretion for relocated buildings in all 5 zones. And obviously in the central city zone, that's one I'm focusing on. It's number 9 on the 3rd page in.
Mhm.
Don't know if you've got that. So that's repeated on all. I guess what I'm wondering about is the necessity of clause 9, given that section 104, there's a general requirement to avoid, remedy, or mitigate any adverse effects of any type. Is it necessary to replicate section 104 there in terms of relocated buildings?
I mean, again, not wedded to that wording there. It's something that we've pulled through, or that I've pulled through in my evidence for all of the chapters since hearing 9.
Okay.
So I guess I was just trying to find that link between the policies and the objectives as well, and through to the strategic objectives as well.
Yes. I was interested in, this is just an observation, that you'd focused on relocated buildings in all 5 zones, as opposed to additions and alterations to, or new structures in your appendix A. It didn't seem to be any change to.
I can just check that. There was a reason why I did not do that.
Well, certainly in the first 2 zones anyway. You may have done that in some of the later zones.
I think, oh yes, that was why. The graduation for relocation buildings is the only activity from permitted to restricted discretionary.
Yes.
So the others are, the other building activities graduate to discretionary.
Yes. So you're happy with the default status for new builds and additions and alterations?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And that the matters that can be considered well, some of the new builds that do start at restricted discretionary, so long as they comply with FEC standards.
Yes. Yes.
And where they don't comply with them, I think they trigger to DA.
Sorry, yes, good point. And that's why I didn't add, I didn't seek to add anything to those rules, because that was covered in the policies.
Okay.
The matters of discretion were restricted to relevant matters in the policies as well.
Understand that. Good clarification. Thank you, Sarah. That's good.
I did have one question, I don't know who to answer that, around when I was checking the activity, when a rule is a restricted discretionary and there's a requirement to consider the compliance with the effect standards as well. And some of the effect standards have matters of discretion if compliance is not achieved. And some of those matters differ to some of the matters in the rules as well. That just was something that came to mind as Commissioner McMahon and I had that conversation.
I might suggest that Lauren could think about that. It's not really for us.
Sorry, it wasn't a question to the panel.
Yeah. David, do you want to say anything, or?
Can you just give me an example, Sarah?
Oh, I knew this was going to come up. I should have checked this. I'm happy to follow it up afterwards. I just remember when I was writing my evidence that I noted it, and I thought it was something I should probably clarify with you. So,
Okay.
Just as a general rule, the rule should trigger the activity status, and the rule will refer to effect standards. And so, for example, with new builds, I think it starts off by saying where the effect standards are complied with. That might include height. Then it's a restricted discretion, and these are matters of discretion. But if they're not complied with, then any of the effect standards not complied with, then it goes to fully discretionary, unless there's a specific non-complying rule covering it. That was my very layman's understanding of it. Lauren can come back in the write a reply and correct me.
Yeah, I will follow that up afterwards. Thank you. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, David. Sarah, I've just got a couple of questions about the design guide comment you made that that Ngāti Te Whiti or Te Kauhitanga and others weren't involved in the preparation of those design guides. And I'm just thinking, given the direction of the strategic objectives and flows right through the other objectives and policies, Mātauranga Māori is certainly well recognised as being an outcome. I've just gone back myself and looked at our interim guidance around the strategic objectives, looking at both the historical and cultural heritage strategic objectives, the Tangata Whenua strategic directions, and UFD 19, which is sort of the design objective in the which clearly does require, or the outcome is that urban environments are well designed, livable, connected, accessible and safe places for the community to live, work and play, which, and among other things, incorporate Mātauranga Māori in the design, construction and development of the built environment. So just trying to rationalise in my own mind if the design guides are going to have like a very strong statutory role within the plan rather than being a guide, what your views are on the design guide. It's both its content, and we've got a separate section on the separate hearing on the design guide, and also how it might be tied into the plan or not, and then who's involved in adjudicating on design guide outcomes. So that's a long question, but just your comments on that as an expert would be appreciated.
Where should I start? So in terms of the design guides, we are providing some advice to council officers as to how our the submission points of tekotaitanga can be could potentially be resolved as well. So just for that, and also to the design guides hearing as well, we will be tekotaitanga have engaged the advice of one of our design creatives amongst the wider whānau, so Rangi Kipper, who was influential in the airport Te Hono development as well. So he was the lead creative for that. So he's been undertaking some review of the design guide for us as well. And what that could look like, or how Mātauranga Māori could be incorporated into those design guides to ensure that they're reflected in built form in the city and town centres as well. And how that, good question around those linkages to the strategic directions as well, the objectives there, particularly Tangata Whenua and the UFD 19. I think that's something that I've really relied on in lots of my evidence in some of my evidence to date as well. So in terms of your question around, I feel like I'm waffling on a bit now, how it could be incorporated. It's probably something I would like to, I haven't spent a lot of time around reflecting on how the design guides would be utilised in practice and in terms of engaging that Mātauranga Māori. So definitely something that we'll traverse in our evidence to the design guides hearing as well.
Mm. I suppose this is the hearing in the process where we need to decide the provisions and how the design guides fit in with the provisions, the content of the design guides for another day. So we want to make some suggestions to the parties about some further discussions on the Central City chapter. And we're going to do that at 1 o'clock when we reconvene and hear back from before we go to the right of reply. And I've asked Kāinga Ora to be available too. So are you available to come back at 1 o'clock?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And just a couple of things just for the record. You've dated your statement 11th of February. That should probably be 28th of February. So just so that we keep that in order, this is your summary. So that's received today. On the front page, it's 1st of March, just your sign off at the end. So look, that's fine. We can
Copy and paste. That's copy and
Yeah,
paste. I'll correct that. I'll correct that anyway.
don't bother, it's on the front page. But Christine, can you, or Michael, if you're there, make sure that Bal and the Kāinga Ora team have seen Sarah's statement this morning, because we're going to have a bit of a discussion at 1 o'clock about next steps. So that's all from me, and that's all from us for the moment. Commissioner McMahon's smiling because that's a
two Ronnie's joke.
It's a boomer joke. So we'll adjourn for the moment and reconvene at 1 o'clock. Thanks for your assistance.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yep. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming back at 1 o'clock. Welcome back, David. And Bal, what's your time constraints?
I'm fine until 2 o'clock. So
Okay.
yeah, all good.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, Lauren, do you want to take us through your reply first, and we can talk about a process from there, depending on where you're up to with various things?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So what I was proposing to do is step through the matters that are specific to zones first, and I'll do that in the order of city centre, town, local, mixed use, large format, and then I would do the matters common across the zones after. But if you want me to chop and change, please just let me know.
No, you just go through how you feel best, Lauren.
Okay, so first up in the city centre zone, we had the rule 12 regarding the demolition or removal of a structure. So for that one, we had Kāinga Ora seeking to remove the parameter entirely, and then there was also Landpro wanting the insertion of that wording, allowing a period of time for establishment of another building. So I guess what council is trying to achieve here is that we want a better outcome than what we've got now. We've got some buildings coming down, and then that are sitting vacant, or we've got some activities happening there that aren't quite desirable. So it's a trigger for us to have a conversation, I guess, and if that's triggered, then council can try and do something about it. So I've talked previously about how we've got our CBD facilitator role. You know, she liaises with lots of people in the central city and also with other agencies like Taranaki Chamber of Commerce, NZTA. So my thinking at this stage is that I would like to retain this parameter, and I'd like to retain it as worded, but I will give some consideration to inserting the time frame there. And I acknowledge or I agree with what Commissioner McMahon said regarding the 3 months suggested, I think that's probably a little bit too short. So that's my thinking at this stage on that particular rule. Okay, next up is the defined pedestrian frontage requirement. And that was Z Energy having concerns there and wanting the insertion of or an exemption for service station, for that service station, which is on the corner of Leavitt and Courtney Streets. So this corner is quite important to council because you're moving off the one-way system and you're coming into that city centre, which is a pedestrian environment. And I've talked in my report about how council's really looking to strengthen the links between Pekura Park and the coast. So there's going to be some projects that fall out of that city centre strategy to make that link more pedestrian friendly, and the identification of that defined pedestrian frontage requirement aligns with that. You know, I agree with Commissioner McMahon. We don't really want to see bespoke provisions inserted into a plan that will become redundant once the property's on sold. So I don't recommend inserting an exemption for this particular service station, but I will consider adding something into the defined pedestrian frontage policy, perhaps, regarding consideration of functional and operational requirements. And I note that if I did it in the city centre zone, I probably need to do it in the town centre and the local centre as well, given that there's also defined pedestrian frontage requirements there. But it's something that I'm open to doing. Next up was the mixed use zone. So we had LandPro seeking that business service activities be permitted in this zone. I guess the map that was put up there does sort of help council's argument in a way, because it does show the proliferation of business service type activities that are happening outside of our central city, and they're the kind of activities that we want in our central city. So at this stage, I don't recommend that we change that to make that a permitted activity, and I feel even stronger about that, given Tim Heath's evidence yesterday about how the city street centre is struggling, and particularly off the back of COVID as well.
Yes, is it okay to intervene, Stephen, or do you want me to wait until the end?
No, just ask as we go through. Any
Okay.
questions, David?
Just on that one, Lauren, wasn't the submitter seeking a lesser activity status? Was it non-complying to permitted that they were asking for?
Yes, that's what I wrote down. I think your question
Yes.
there on that. And
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and you think you don't think permitted is appropriate, but do you see any room for movement from non-complying to a lesser activity status other than permitted?
Well, I really have to analyse all of those definitions that fall under the permitted service activity list.
Yes.
I know that they talk about things like parking requirements. You know, some of it might be suitable in some instances. I'd really have to look into it. There
Yes.
might be room for it, but you know, I'm a bit reluctant to do it given the state that our CBD is in at the moment.
Yes.
And
I'm looking at.
given that we've got that objective too, we're at the top of our mixed use zone, about we are looking to limit the frequency and the type of those activities.
Yes, and I do acknowledge that that's matched by policy 3, which lists business service activities as an incompatible activity. You know my feeling on the use of non-complying activity, that it should be used sparingly. And I asked the question of the planner for the submitter, whether the business services activities was a MPS definition or a district plan one. Can you shed some light on that?
This one is a council definition, not a
Yes.
MPS one.
Is there a solution in the definition such that the type of it's business service activities is quite broad, isn't it? And by definition, is there an ability to alter the definition so that some of those activities might not be caught by the non-complying activity rule?
Just bring it up.
Yes, if you could, that would be useful. Because I used the term yesterday when I was questioning, who was it? Mr. Osborne. And I thought when he was talking about business service, commercial officers, he was talking about business service activities. But in hindsight, I don't think that is the case. Commercial officers are commercial
Okay.
services, aren't they?
Officers are
Yeah.
business service activities.
Oh, are they?
Yes, yeah, so
Mm.
business service activities are offices of businesses, local and government agencies and community
Yeah.
entities. Professional services such as
Yes.
lawyers, accountants, engineering, surveyors.
Okay.
Personal services such as racing and postal
Yes.
services.
Okay, so I was on the mark there. What's interesting because he said in response to a number of questions, both for myself and the chair, that if he had to isolate a single activity to lead the recovery in the central zones, it would be commercial officers. Yet these are the activities that are seen as being incompatible, at least in the mixed use zone anyway.
Yes,
And I just wonder how that activity status sits with that evidence.
well, I guess what he's saying aligns with how our plan's set up. So we are enabling business service activities in the the city centre zone, so it aligns with that.
Yes.
And we're trying to stop this bleed out into the mixed use zone. We're trying to
Yes.
consolidate that zone. So
Yes.
in a way, it does align with what he's saying.
Okay. I did hear him say that, and although this was in relation to residential, that the question for him is whether residential is in the mixed use zone would whether retail in the mixed use zone would where the residential in the mixed use zone would encourage bleed out into the mixed use zone, or whether it would bolster the function of the mixed use zone supporting the town centre and central city zones. And I guess I'm posing the same question in relation to commercial officers, whether there is a complementary role between the mixed use zone and the central city zone in terms of supporting each other. I wondered if you give
I
it.
guess there is a complementary role there, but it's not, it would be happening well out from our city centre zone. Ideally, we want that to be happening in the city centre zone. So, for example, people in offices can pop out in their lunch hour and get a coffee, or go buy a present for their mum, or what have you, and it all stimulates the activity in the central city. So
Yes.
yeah.
The
me,
mixed
it's
use
about
zone.
the help.
Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say what my driver is here is the help with the city centre.
Yes.
And we've heard from Mr. Heath that it's not in great shape.
Yes, and we've heard, and I think they both agree that residential and commercial services can play a role in trying to reverse that. The question in my mind is, given that the mixed use zone wraps around the central city zone in a spatial sense, does that can that assist in that revitalisation as opposed to halting the revitalisation?
Well, I think it can do it to a degree, and but I wouldn't want to see that happening all over the mixed use zone, because it's not going to be resolving that issue that we have, because we're still going to be having that rubber band effect where anybody can go wherever they like. So quite keen for it to happen in the central city, but not necessarily out in that mixed use zone.
Or not in a permitted sense anyway.
No. not
No.
in this permitted
Just
zone.
it still raises a question whether non-compliant activity status is necessary to stop that development, that type of activity occurring in the mixed use zone completely.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah, I can look into a lower.
Just to follow up from me, Lauren, clearly the nexus between the objectives and policies, if what I'm hearing from you is that the objectives and policies are really around making a vital and vibrant city centre.
Mm.
And if that is the objective, would you say that non-complying activity status is the right rule for mixed use? If that big range of activities on that plan, they could equally well be taking space in the town centre, couldn't they?
Which activities could be happening there, sorry?
Ms. Dawson's plan, which she showed us with all those activities in the mixed use zone, all those businesses, they could probably just as easily locate in the central city, couldn't they?
Yes, or in any of our centres.
Or in the other centres. And the reason they're probably out there is because the rent's a bit cheaper, perhaps, I'm not sure.
Yes.
And they're all sort of professional businesses. So I'm just trying to make sure that we've got that. You know, many of them would probably, yeah, whether many of them will be turned off by discretionary status, I'm not sure. So if you, I think that you know, I think you're pretty clear in your view, you'll obviously land that and let us know what you think, and then we'll take it from there, I think, David. Back with you, David.
Oh, okay. Sorry, didn't realise that. Okay. Well, there's clear direction there. I just wondered whether is the greatest threat to the central city zone activities such as commercial offices establishing in the mixed use zone, or does the town centre zone also provide that threat to the vitality of the central city zone? There's a difference between the threats or risks posed in the mixed use zone and the town centre zone to the central city zone achieving vitality.
I wouldn't have thought there was too much threat from the town centre zone on the city centre zone, given that that's only going to be in 3 places: Inglewood, Waitara, and I've also recommended Fitzroy.
Yes.
I think the threat is definitely retail and offices in that mixed use zone.
Yes. The reason I asked, okay, yeah, okay, I understand that answer. The reason I asked that question, Lauren, is those town centre zones are spatially divorced from the central city zone. And
Inglewood and Waitara are. Fitzroy is a little bit closer.
Yes, but not necessarily as close as the mixed use zone to the central city zone. No, and that's what I'm sort of picking up from the evidence of Mr. Heath and sorry, I forgot his name, Mr. Osborne, that there is some complementarity between the mixed use zone and the central city zone, and it's a fine line in his view whether these sort of activities are bleeder activities from the central city or whether they're complementary activities. So that's what I took from his evidence yesterday. And then there's that additional spatial component that I just referred to. So I guess if you can consider that in the mix and come back to us on the right of reply, I guess it boils down to whether the definition of business service activities can be sliced and diced to allow for commercial offices, or whether the policy can be tweaked, or whether the activity status can be relaxed slightly. They're the three things I'd prefer you to come back to us on.
So the first was the definition.
Yes, the definition, so that it's sliced and diced, and maybe components such as commercial offices pulled out of the definition, because it's not a definition that you're wedded, the plan has to be wedded to in terms of the MPS. It's your own definition, so you have more scope to alter it.
Yep.
Second is policy relief, and the third was relaxation of activity status, or a combination of the above. Thank you. And Stephen, that was my interruption, sorry, on that mixed use rule.
Okay, I have that down. Okay, so moving on to the Kaingaora had an issue with the mixed use zone S2, the height in relation to boundary. Unfortunately, I didn't get to hear too much about that. So that was about removing open space in recreation. So I'll review the evidence and I'll give that some thought in my right of reply, but I do know that there are some areas where there is an open space zone in Fitzroy and Waitara, where it joins the mixed use zone. Next up was the mixed use zone S4, landscaping requirements on the road boundary, and this was Z Energy. They had a primary and then a secondary relief that they were seeking, and the primary being that there was an exception where a site is utilised by an existing service station activity. So yeah, I acknowledge that service stations are critical to the way that we live. They do have a significant number of traffic movements, and visibility to the forecourt is definitely critical to a successful operation, as is signage. And I also acknowledge that issue with the planting of the trees, where they could be substantial over time, creating a nuisance. Commercially and in terms of route extent, again, council doesn't really want to see bespoke provisions in the plan, and I don't really think it's appropriate to single out a specific activity. So I guess if they don't feel that they can provide what's required in the plan, then the trigger of this standard provides an opportunity to discuss what alternative methods can be provided. So at this stage, I would not be recommending a change to my recommendation on that. So moving on to the approach in the mixed use zone as a whole. So as you know, I'm really mindful of the health of the city centre, and we had that recent update from Mr. Heath on the impact of COVID on the central city, and it's not looking too good. But I'm also mindful that Kaingaora have made a submission wanting residential to be permitted, and that there are other submitters wanting that as well, and that we also have our MPS UD guiding us there. So I'm trying to come up with a bit of a compromise from what was notified, and I'm trying to narrow this down, I guess, a bit. So where I'm kind of landing at the moment is I don't support residential in the mixed use zone living precinct being permitted, because I'm concerned that this will make it more attractive to developers, that they will want to come to the mixed use zone as opposed to the city centre zone, because in the city centre zone, it will be a restricted discretionary activity to erect, alter or add on. And I'm concerned that will be seen as a hindrance and that the mixed use zone will be more attractive. So I think I'm going to continue to recommend that residential in this area be permitted. I've also heard that Kaingaora wants design guidelines. I would only support design guidelines in a regulatory tool, not a non-regulatory tool. Otherwise, as I mentioned yesterday, they just sit on the shelf and they're not used. So I'm wondering if there is a possibility to make multi-unit housing a restricted discretionary activity, and that the provisions would be similar to the ones that we have in the central city zone, where we have erections, alterations, additions, and they would be subject to a design guide. And the design guide would be the one that we have operating in the residential zone. We've already done the work, it's already sitting there, it's already ready to go. And we had a good example of that Soho development where we were able to hand it over to the developer. So that's sort of my thinking at this stage. So I'm also thinking that it probably should only apply just to multi-unit housing, not to all types of housing. Otherwise, it's going to trigger just your single-story detached house, and I don't think that's what we're after. And I don't really think it's appropriate that we make all activities in the mixed-use zone subject to design. This zone as a whole is about commercial service activities. It's where people put tyres onto tractors and cars, and it's where they distribute jib board. It's not about an area where we're trying to make it attractive. But I'm hoping that this might be a bit of a way of moving forward. So following on from that, I think we could change that policy that we have, the MUS P4. So currently we have that as a support policy for multi-unit housing developments. But I like Mr. Campbell's suggestion that we could make that enable multi-unit housing developments in the mixed-use zone living precinct to make that more clearer. And I have had a look at the map that Mr. Ray provided with some of those residential precincts there, so I can give you some feedback on what I think with those blue hatched areas that he's provided. So I quite like the ones that he's provided in the west. I did the zone audits in these areas, and I particularly like that area on Devon Street, which is it's a block away from the Eye basically, and that the heart of that West End precinct. And I like that street. It kind of feels like we're tucked away. You've got the one-way system on the southern side, and you've got Molesworth Street, another state highway on the other side, but the land does dip down. So I particularly like that area. To the north, in the east, we have had applications in the past there for housing. So it does seem a way that the community wants to head. In the east, perhaps a little bit more concerned about where we would go in this area, because we've got a lot of commercial service activities happening here, and the danger is if we make too much of this area a residential precinct, then these types of activities are going to go out to the Waiwakaio Valley, and that's going to be further for people to travel. So that's my only real concern there. But I'd also like to have a look at these areas as well in terms of how they relate to the zoning requests, because we have had rezoning requests from Kaingaora to widen out that mixed use zone. So that would just have to be a consideration there, that I ensure that any living precinct is within those boundaries of that mixed use zone. That's sort of where I'm at with the mixed use zone. So do you have any questions on that before I move on to more general stuff across all of the zones?
Not for me, Lauren.
No, Lauren, I think I've captured all of that. So yeah, proceed with the next one.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the matters that are more common across all of the zones. So we had Te Atiawa with their the reference to the suitably qualified cultural expert and some expanded wording in there, appearing in the city centre zone, the town centre zone, and the local centre zone. So I guess the point I want to start off making is that I do acknowledge that tangata whenua are cultural experts, and I think that that should be reflected in those zones in some way. However, I'm mindful that we've got some consistency issues appearing in our section 42A reports. So for example, I released a version on view shafts back in about October, and I'm aware that Denise Young has made another recommendation recently in the rural production zone report that's similar but differs. So, you know, ideally we want this drafting to be consistent. So I'd like to go away and make sure that it is consistent throughout the plan in terms of how we use it. But yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that I do accept that they are cultural experts. It's just about getting the wording right in the plan. And then Te Atiawa also had that other request in there about adding matters of discretion for cultural, spiritual and heritage values. So I would like to go away and have a look at this as well. This wasn't in the initial submission that's coming through the statement of evidence. So I think I just need to go away and have a look at that as well, and also look at the consistency throughout the plan as well. So in terms of Kāinga Ora's submission regarding design guidelines and wanting matters of discretion with a note regarding a non-regulatory design guide as opposed to having a regulatory design guide. I think I've already mentioned it previously and made myself clear that I think it's necessary to have design guides that are regulatory, not non-regulatory, otherwise they will just be sitting on the shelf. And I note that we actually do have a non-regulatory design guideline at the moment in our rural area. It's a rural set of design guidelines that are non-regulatory and nobody uses them, which is unfortunate. So I think in order for something to be meaningful, it needs to be connected to the rule. I think perhaps there is some room for movement with the matters of discretion that are in some of these rules. So at the moment, for example, it says the extent to which the activity complies with the design guide or something similar. So perhaps we can go away and have a look at making that a bit more explicit about what it is within the design guideline. So, you know, some options could be those headings within the design guideline, or Mr. Ray mentioned the outcomes that are in there. But I really need to go away and have a chat with Campbell Robinson, who's going to be the reporting planner on design guidelines. So that one's coming up in a month or two, I think it is. The relocation of a building, I talked to that this morning, so I'm quite happy to remove the need for a bond here, but I would be looking to keep the reinstatement works report, and the House Movers Association seem to be okay with that this morning. Height limits. So I've had a good chat with Richard in the break, and I think there is some room for movement here in all of the zones. Well, I'm actually going to rephrase that. There's some room for movement, I think, in the town centre zone, the local centre zone, the mixed use zone, but not necessarily in the city centre zone. So I'm going to get Richard to talk to this because Richard is the expert on this, and I take my guidance from him. So I'm going to pass this over to Richard to deal with this.
Okay, so Laura and I have discussed this zone height. So with regard to the town centre zone, so this is Inglewood, Wairara, and probably Fitzroy, or Fitzroy is going to be included. These town centres are currently sort of 2 and 3 story high townships, mostly 2-story. The proposed district plan was for 12 metres, which was the idea was that was to enable a 3 or 4 story high building. In light of the submissions and our thinking, we're happy to go to 14 metres to provide comfort that a 4-story building can be fully achievable. With the local centre zone, so this is your suburban little shopping places, your Marylands, Aokura, and so on. The proposed district plan is 10 metres. Kaingaroa's submission is 11 metres plus 1. We see those as sufficiently close that there's really little difference. So council's happy to make that zone 11 plus 1 as per the Kaingaroa's submission. The mixed use zone, we've had the same discussion and things have gone around our head as Commissioner McMahon just referred to about whether these residential development in these areas will be complementary or bleeder. Working on the theory that perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle, and that certainly outside our expertise, Lauren and I are of the view that we're proposing 10 metres. We're of the view that perhaps this could go to 14 metres in the zone. Now that's the same height as much of the CBD is under the operative plan, and that would make it the same height as the town centre zone, which I've just previously referred to. We're suggesting that 14 metres in the mixed use zone could be an appropriate height. We know what 14 metres looks like because it's a common height in our central city area. It's 4 metres taller than the ODP height, and that would certainly, 14 metres would enable a Soho type development that we showed yesterday as an example, possibly even a floor taller than that. So that's what we've got to on the mixed use zone. For the central city zone, we're comfortable with our approach that we have, where in essence, we've taken the operative district plan heights for the CBD, which are mostly 14 metres and 10 around the edges. We've increased those quite a lot in our areas C and D to 17 and 22. We are mindful of the tall buildings we have that are standalone and are sore thumb, and my view is that it's not enough to just say that's due to the fact that they were designed in the 80s. They were fashionable in the 80s. So a new building would be fashionable now, it may not be in the future. I think the effects come from their height. So we're comfortable with our approach. However, I'm mindful of the work that Nick's undertaken, and we think that the only way to get really more, the only way I think the council will be there to move on the heights, you'd have to have it do a much more fine-grained detail assessment of the CBD. By Nick's own admission, his was used, rough contours, and it used a sort of a block approach. You'd have to do a fine-grained study to identify exactly which parts of the city could go taller than we are proposing. And we just think that wouldn't provide any greater benefit than could be done through a resource consent process, which could then just assess the individual building at the time. I was also mindful of, it was interesting Sarah Marco's comment this morning about how she could see the Atkinson building from the sea. And that is a good example to me of that's the sort of information I think you would want if you were building, if a tall building was proposed, say between the Atkinson building and the sea, for example. So you would only be able to undertake that kind of assessment for a resource consent process. So I think what council's view is that our height limits give us comfort, we can accept those effects, but the taller either requires a much more detailed study of the CBD to look at individual parcels almost, or we take the approach that we're proposing and rely on the resource consent process for individual applications that are taller. That's all from me.
Richard, just picking up your last point there, do you think that Katie Holdings application that we keep referring to was a good example where a successful application can be made on a one-off site basis? That was a pretty unique site on that corner right beside the Huatoki. It won through for many reasons, including some of the cultural dimensions and design and reflections. So is that proof in the pudding of what you're saying? That type of
Yes, I think. Yes, I think that building and that process that you were commissioner for is a perfect example of that, because it's well over height from the underlying zone, and yet the process enabled a full redesign iteration. You may remember the top was redesigned, and it involved full input from Mana Whenua, and combine all those things. We haven't seen the building yet, but your decision was that it's a good outcome, and I would agree with that. And I think it needed that level of detail to ensure that outcome, that the detail of a process, a consent process.
Okay, no, thank you for that. That's interesting.
Okay, I'll move on to the next point, which was the use of the term extent and effect of non-compliance. So I understand that this issue was raised last week in the residential visitor accommodation hearing. And this has got plan-wide implications, and we've got Lauren Wallace, our lawyer, looking into that. So I will wait to hear back on what she advises us, and I will report back my right of reply accordingly.
Lauren, and you'll see Belle's given us some more thoughts and a supplementary piece, some supplementary submissions, which I think will be helpful to share with Lauren Wallace and to get her view based on that.
Okay, thank you. I will forward that on to her. Okay, next up was the effect standard regarding boundary fence and wall requirements. And this is in the city centre zone S3, town centre zone S5, and local centre zone S6. So I'm open to amending those rules as suggested by Kyle Ora, because that provides clarity. So I'm happy to do that. The same with the effect standard regarding landscaping and fencing. So this was in regards to a new effect standard that I recommended in the town centre zone. LCZ S4 and MUS S5. So this was about, instead of it saying landscaping requirements for sites, it was going to say landscaping and fencing. So I'm happy to do that. Kaingaora was seeking some landscaping requirements on road boundary for the city centre zone, town centre zone, and local centre zone. I just don't think this is necessary, and I'm a bit mindful in terms of outcomes that can come out of this. I mean, often, you know, it's good in theory. You know, people put in stuff, but then they don't necessarily maintain it. And I guess I would prefer a bit more of a coordinated, planned, comprehensive approach. And we are going to get that through the city centre strategy, where there's several projects regarding planting in there. So at this stage, I don't see it as being necessary, but I will give it some consideration. And I'm a little bit the same with the outlook space effect standard. If I was to put one in, it might be this one, but I'm still really concerned. It's such a complex rule. I struggle to understand that. I don't know how a layperson would go with that. And we do have it in, we've got reference to outlook space in the design guide as well. So a little bit on the fence with this one at this stage. And then the final one I had was the any activity not otherwise listed. So at the moment, we've got them as permitted in the city centre zone, town centre zone and local centre zone, and Kaingaora is seeking that they be discretionary given the need to have high quality urban design. I'm thinking at this stage to keep it the same, you know, to keep it permitted. You know, we are trying to send the signal that these centres are go zones, and you know, we don't want to be putting any more impediments up. And I do note that any erection or alteration or addition of a building is going to be caught by that restricted discretionary rule in the city centre zone and the town centre zone anyway. So at this stage, my thinking is to not recommend a change there. And that is the end of my list.
Thank you, Lauren. Sounds like the bit of time we had did give you a chance to sit down with Richard and talk about these key height issues, and certainly, you know, we were very grateful for Nick and that detailed work he'd done, and just some time to reflect on that with Richard. So good value. We did start by thinking about, given where you're at and you're sitting now with your right of reply, whether you see any value in some further discussions. What's your thinking about that?
I'm really mindful of time moving forward. I've got a pretty busy couple of weeks. You know, I think we've come some way with those height limits, particularly not in the central city, but other areas. And I think we've made it quite clear that we think that we're okay with those height limits in the central city, and we have made quite a jump there, and we feel like we can deal to it through the resource consent process. So I'm thinking perhaps it's unnecessary at this stage. If we had more time, yes, but we don't. So I'm just trying to be a bit realistic there, I guess.
Okay, oh, that's certainly good. And just listening to where you've ended up with a number of these things, there's a few things you're dwelling on, but the sorts of things that you're dwelling on are really matters that as a planner, you just have to consider the evidence as we have and give us your best advice. So on a time and motion study, it probably sounds like you're comfortable just taking what you've got out of this hearing, which I think has been very, very useful for all of us. But certainly, you know, it's in the hearing procedures. Reach out to any of your peers who are appearing for submitters just on a as required basis, and just recording a right of reply. You've done that, and what any resolution or not might have been. So I think that's keeping it above board and clear would be good.
Okay.
So Belle or Sarah, Mike, do you have any other final comments before we close this hearing?
No, thank you. Not for me, Commissioner. That was interesting.
Sarah?
No, ka pai, thank you.
Okay, we'll leave that intriguing comment that Belle's has given us and close the hearing. Sarah, could you please again indulge for you to give us a closing prayer to finish this hearing?
Yeah, ka pai. Whenua kia pai te rā, koutou mā, he karakia whakamutunga, unuhia. Unuhia I te uru tapunui, kia wātea, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takutu. Koia rā e rongo pakiria ke kirunga, tuturu whakamaua kia tina, hui e, taiki e.
Okay, thank you very much and appreciate everyone's involvement and assistance. And we're now through another hearing, which is great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, David.